When Donald Trump returned to the White House for his second term, a familiar anxiety resurfaced almost immediately. It showed up in American headlines, in think tank panels, in op-eds, and perhaps most intensely, in conversations far from Washington. In Taiwan itself, the question was simple, blunt, and emotionally charged. Would Trump abandon Taiwan? For many people, especially those who lived through his first term, the concern felt reasonable. Trump did not speak about Taiwan the way Joe Biden had. He did not repeatedly declare that the United States would defend the island. He did not frame the issue in terms of democracy versus authoritarianism. Instead, he spoke vaguely, sometimes dismissively, and often transactionally. To some ears, that sounded like danger. To others, it sounded like betrayal waiting to happen. But here is the uncomfortable reality Americans need to face, and it may not sit well with either side of the political aisle. The problem is not that Trump might abandon Taiwan. The problem is that most Americans are asking the wrong question entirely. The real issue is not what Trump says about Taiwan. The real issue is what the United States would lose, structurally, strategically, and irreversibly, if Taiwan were lost, whether by abandonment, miscalculation, or delay. Because once you understand that cost, the question of whether any U.S. president would willingly give Taiwan up starts to look very different. In American political culture, there is a saying that has survived every administration, every party, and every scandal: do not listen to what politicians say. Watch what they do. Words are cheap. Budgets are not. Laws are not. Forced posture is not. So if we want to understand American policy toward Taiwan under Trump, we have to stop fixating on tone and start examining behavior. In just the first year of Trump's second term, the United States approved hundreds of millions of dollars in arms sales to Taiwan, including critical spare parts for F-16 fighters and C-130 transport aircraft. Within weeks, that was followed by an even larger package, more than $11 billion, one of the largest single arms sales to Taiwan in American history. This was not symbolic equipment. This was sustainment, readiness, and survivability. At the same time, the administration released a new national security strategy that explicitly identified deterrence in the Taiwan Strait as a core objective of U.S. military planning, emphasizing that Taiwan must strengthen asymmetric capabilities designed to make invasions slow, costly, and unpredictable. Congress, with bipartisan support, passed a National Defense Authorization Act that included up to $1 billion for a Taiwan Security Cooperation Initiative, which Trump signed into law without hesitation. The Taiwan Assurance Implementation Act was operationalized, expanding official engagement and clarifying security commitments. These are not the actions of a government preparing to walk away. They are the actions of a government reinforcing a position while deliberately avoiding rhetorical commitments that would lock it into automatic escalation. This distinction matters because ambiguity is often misunderstood in American discourse as weakness or indecision. In reality, strategic ambiguity has been a core feature of U.S. Taiwan policy for decades, across Democratic and Republican administrations alike. It exists not because Washington is unsure what it wants, but because clarity carries risks. Ambiguity serves two functions at once. It deters Beijing by preserving uncertainty about American intervention, and it restrains Taipei by avoiding a blank check that could encourage unilateral moves. The nightmare scenario for Washington is not simply a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. It is a war triggered by miscalculation on either side that drags the United States into a conflict on the worst possible terms. Trump's style makes this uncomfortable because it strips away moral language and exposes the logic beneath. He speaks in terms of leverage, cost, and reciprocity. That feels cold, even cynical. But cold logic is not the same as abandonment. Much of the fear surrounding Taiwan today comes from a comparison that feels intuitive but is deeply misleading: Ukraine. Many Americans look at Trump's skepticism toward Ukraine and assume Taiwan would be treated the same way. After all, both are smaller partners facing larger authoritarian neighbors. Both are outside NATO. Both depend heavily on U.S. support. But this comparison collapses under serious scrutiny. Ukraine's war is tragic and consequential, but it is not structurally existential to American global power. Ukraine sits deep in the European landmass. If Russia dominates Ukraine, the primary threat falls on Europe, not directly on the United States. Russia lacks the economic, technological, and demographic capacity to replace the U.S. As the central node of the global system, China does not. This single difference changes everything. Taiwan is not important because it is democratic. It is not important because it is sympathetic. It is not important because Americans feel morally invested in it. Taiwan is important because it sits at the center of the most critical military geography in the Indo-Pacific, the first island chain. This chain, stretching from Japan through Taiwan and down toward the Philippines, functions as the forward edge of American deterrence in Asia. Taiwan is its central hinge. If Taiwan were absorbed by Beijing, the Chinese Navy would gain direct, sustained access to the Western Pacific. U.S. defensive lines around Japan and Guam would be compromised. Forward deployed forces would need to retreat eastward. The cost of defending allies would rise dramatically, permanently. This would not be a loss of a partner. It would be a collapse of architecture. And architecture, once lost, is not easily rebuilt. Beyond geography, Taiwan plays a quieter but equally vital role in military intelligence. The waters and airspace around Taiwan are critical for monitoring Chinese naval movements, tracking submarine activity, observing missile deployments, and maintaining early warning visibility over the People's Liberation Army's Eastern Theater. Modern warfare is shaped by information. What you cannot see, you cannot deter. Without Taiwan, American visibility in East Asia would degrade sharply. Then there is technology, the word most Americans associate with Taiwan, semiconductors. But this is not about smartphones or stock prices. Advanced chips underpin artificial intelligence, missile guidance, secure communications, supercomputing, and space systems. Taiwan's semiconductor ecosystem is not just a factory. It is a network of human capital, institutional knowledge, and supply chain integration that cannot be replicated quickly or cleanly. Yes, the United States is reshoring production. Yes, diversification is underway, but reshoring is risk mitigation, not replacement. If Taiwan were absorbed by China, the balance of technological leverage would shift. Sanctions would lose potency. Export controls would weaken. China would gain asymmetric advantages in dual-use technologies that shape both civilian and military power. Even more destabilizing than the military or technological consequences would be the psychological shock to America's alliance system. If the United States failed to defend Taiwan, allies would not parse legal nuances or diplomatic explanations. They would draw a simple conclusion: American red lines are negotiable. Japan would reassess its security assumptions. South Korea would reconsider nuclear options. The Philippines and Vietnam would hedge more aggressively toward Beijing. Europe would accelerate its push for strategic autonomy, not out of hostility, but out of self-preservation. America would still be powerful. It would still be rich. It would still have formidable armed forces. But it would no longer be the anchor of the system. At this point, a necessary distinction must be made because it is often blurred in public debate. Losing Taiwan is not the same as abandoning Taiwan. A U.S. president might never choose to give Taiwan up, and Taiwan could still be lost due to speed, miscalculation, delayed response, or domestic paralysis. History is full of great powers that did not decide to retreat. They simply arrived too late to prevent irreversible outcomes. This is why the most dangerous assumption is that intention alone determines results. Would the United States automatically go to war for Taiwan? No, and no serious strategist believes otherwise. But neither would the United States stand aside casually. The real American red line is not moral. It is strategic. China must not be able to take Taiwan quickly, cheaply, and without catastrophic cost. As long as that remains true, deterrence holds. Once that calculation changes, the entire equation becomes unstable. This logic applies regardless of who sits in the Oval Office. Democrats and Republicans argue about language, but they converge on structure. No president wants to be remembered as the one who presided over the collapse of America's position in Asia. There is only one scenario in which Taiwan's strategic importance collapses: a China that is no longer a hostile power. If Beijing were governed by a regime aligned with the US-led order, Taiwan would cease to be a frontline. Short of that, Taiwan remains a structural necessity, not a sentimental choice. This brings us to the most uncomfortable truth of all, one that neither hawks nor isolationists like to confront. Taiwan's security ultimately depends not only on American power, but on Taiwanese resolve. External support can raise costs, buy time, and shape calculations. It cannot substitute for domestic will. No foreign military, no matter how powerful, can defend a society that has decided not to defend itself. And the inverse is also true. A society determined to resist fundamentally reshapes the choices available to its partners. So when Americans ask whether Trump, or any president, would abandon Taiwan, they are asking the wrong thing. The real question is whether the United States is willing to live in the world that follows if Taiwan is lost. Because Taiwan is not America's moral burden, it is America's strategic load-bearing beam. If that beam breaks, the house does not collapse overnight. But from that moment on, everyone knows it is sinking. And that is why, despite the noise, the posturing, and the discomfort, Taiwan remains where it is, not because of sentiment, not because of promises, but because the cost of letting it go is greater than most Americans are willing to admit.